for today's webinar. As you can have just heard, we are intending to record this particular presentation just so that other people can view it at their leisure at a later date. I hope nobody's got any issue with that. So today's webinar kindly delivered by Stefan Boss, who is WSP's Technical Director in their Environmental Assessment and Consents team. And today's presentation is on the current government consultation on the environmental outcomes reports. I think the closing date for that is the 9th of June. So Stefan is also part of the Policy and Practice Committee at the Institute of Environmental Management and Assessment, and he will be assisting IEMA with their response to this particular consultation. Stefan also has over 20 years of experience providing environmental planning advice and support, and of course the LPDF thank him for his taking the time today to take us through this presentation. So I'll hand over to Stefan in a minute. We will have about a 20-minute presentation and then chance for questions and answers after that. If you could put your questions and answers in the Q&A function at the bottom, and I'll monitor that throughout the presentation and feed those questions into Stefan at the end of the presentation. So over to you, Stefan, and thanks for joining us today.
Phil, thank you, and thank you to you and the LPDF for the opportunity to talk today. So yeah, I'm going to try and keep it relatively short so we have plenty of time for questions at the end. As Phil mentioned, I've been an EIA consultant for 20 or so years, so these are some quite important changes or proposed changes for me, but I think also actually quite important for the development industry. So thanks for making the time to come. So as Phil mentioned, the current consultation is on the introduction of environmental outcome reports. It's been led by DLUC, and the consultation closes on the 9th of June. There were 23 questions to respond to, and then the opportunity to provide wider comments. The comments are predominantly open questions, and I think that's quite welcoming. And you know, as Phil mentioned, IEMA, WSP, LPDF all going to be responding to the consultation, and the intention is that today I want to highlight some of the sort of the key changes, some of the risks that might be reduced, some of the risks that might be introduced, but also sort of start to talk about some of the issues that, if you are wanting to respond to consultation, that you might want to include. So environmental outcome reports, and one thing I think is really important to start off with saying is that although the government talk about being in discussion with the devolved administrations around environmental outcome reports, we understand that there is currently no or very little appetite in Wales, Scotland or Northern Ireland for moving away from environmental impact assessment. So it may well be that this is change that is enacted in England only, and that we have a different regime in place in other parts of the UK. So that's one to monitor, but it is worth having in mind that this is likely at the moment to be England only. And at a fundamental level, what environmental outcome reports are trying to do is really, really sensible. It's about trying to filter down the environmental objectives that the government set out in its environmental improvement plan into plans and into projects. So the environmental improvement plan is the first revision of the government's 25-year environment plan, and sets out how the government wants to work with landowners, communities and businesses to deliver each of our goals for improving the environment with interim targets. So it's about cascading that down, and the intention then is that environmental outcome reports will be assessments of plans, replacing strategic environmental assessment sustainability appraisal, and for projects, replacing environmental impact assessment. And that the reporting, instead of being about the significance of effects, will be about assessing against environmental outcomes. And there's going to be secondary legislation to set out what those environmental outcomes should be. And all basically about trying to make sure that the government is delivering against what it set out in the improvement plan. Just thought it was very briefly worth talking about the issues that the government's trying to address through the introduction of EOR. They want assessment to be efficient and effective and carried out at the right time. And they feel that there should be avoidance of duplication of work that might be carried out elsewhere. There's recognition that EIA in particular can be a frequent area of legal challenge, and that sort of risk-averse approach can lead to additional costs for developers, for authorities, as well as delay. That can also lead to a lack of focus, whether or not that's through inadequate scoping, and other issues that sort of don't allow a decision maker in a local community to really understand the important issues. And there can be a lack of available data or data not carried through the planning process. And actually, I suggest let's sort of cycle back to some of those objectives at the end to see how we think the government's fared against them. I thought you'd like to see this quote, which is what the government says that environmental outcome reports will deliver for developers. So an outcome-based approach will provide the certainty developers need to embed environmental considerations into the earlier stages of the project. This certainty will allow developers to focus on delivering for the environment rather than guarding against the risk of legal challenge, which will reduce costs and delays for unnecessary work. I think that the last line there is naturally something the development industry can be excited about. And I think it's quite interesting that the other 4 lines are very focused about how developers can deliver for the environment, and that being the focus that the government has put upon this. So let's start with the basics then. So when will EOR be required? Well, I've mentioned it's going to be for plans and for projects. I'm probably going to talk a little bit more today about projects rather than plans. So for projects, at the moment within EIA, we have Schedule 1 and Schedule 2. Schedule 1 always requires EIA. Schedule 2 has some criteria, and then it's for projects that are likely to have significant effects. Well, we've got something really similar with EOR. We've got categories rather than schedules, but otherwise quite a similar approach. What I think is really positive is the government's looking at trying to be more prescriptive for category 2 projects. You know, there's been lots of challenge around the requirement for or the screening process and the requirement for EIA. That challenge tends to come late and causes lots of delay. The intention is to have much clearer criteria around size of development, distance to designated site, perhaps drawing in the source pathway receptor model, such that actually it's much more black and white about when EOR is required, and hopefully therefore less potential for challenge. It's worth just mentioning that obviously the Environment Act has got the no regression clause in relation to environmental protections. Over the last 10 years or so, the government has tried to lift the burden as to when EIA has been required, so it wouldn't be a particular surprise if they do the same in terms of how they set those category 1 and category 2 definitions. There's quite an interesting potential inclusion, the fact that if a environmental outcome report has found that at a plan level has found that a project is going to have acceptable outcomes and the suitable mitigation, then an EOR may not be required at the project stage if that mitigation is still complied with. I think that's really quite interesting. It's really quite positive. Go back to the risk type point. I think we just want to be really careful around that, and probably wouldn't want to be the first one to be challenged on that, but that is quite a positive change. The government's also then been quite clear about what it wants EOR to assess, and that's those 8 disciplines that are on the screen there. And there is also the suggestion that EOR should include a proportionate assessment of all of those outcomes, so removal of the scoping process, but proportionate consideration of all of them. There's a few things that are not covered. So, you know, we've still got habitats regulations assessment, water framework directive assessment, etc., that could sit outside of the EOR process, and that seems unfortunate and a missed opportunity not to bring it together. Climate change is a really notable omission from what's on that screen. The MPPF consultation includes 4 potential requirements for carbon impact assessment. And I think this is reflecting on the project level climate change assessments in EIA where we're not finding significant effects. But then when all developments aggregated together, that's when issues arise. So climate change is currently outside. And then some of the issues that we've been used to assessing over the years, socioeconomics, health, daylight, sunlight, they're not there. So we think we'd still expect information to be required by determining authorities and to demonstrate compliance with policy, but outside of the umbrella of EOR. So that could well be more efficient. The government's made clear that they are considering the approach to cumulative assessment, perhaps thinking that might sit better at a plan level, but recognising that there's a challenge about the data that might be available to allow them to do that. Just one quick reflection on the removal of scoping. That's a natural stage where we've been used to engaging with consultees, and that engagement and understanding their issues, trying to get their buy-in, is so valuable. So I think that kind of consultation during the pre-application process is going to still be important, and we'll just need to be a little bit more proactive about how we do that. So environmental outcomes and then the indicators that support them. I've mentioned that there's going to be consultation on this, so the government will be consulting on what the environmental outcomes that they're seeking to achieve will be. And quite interestingly, they're going to set that in secondary legislation. They're going to identify indicators to set out how they're going to measure that and how a development contributes to it. And we're going to have indicators at a strategic level for plans and a project level for projects. And what I think is really positive is that the government has said there's going to be guidance around EOR. It's taken years, probably decades, for the courts to resolve many of the uncertainties in the EIA regime. So hopefully the guidance will make that process so much simpler, and we won't have quite as much referral to the courts. The consultation includes one example as to how an outcome and indicators could work. So I thought it was worth us just talking about this. So this is for biodiversity. The outcome, an increase in the abundance of protected species and supporting habitat. I mean, wow, I think we could really pore over every word. What is abundance? An increase, but is that an increase in all species and all habitats, or is there a potential for it to be a net increase? How do we deal with that? And actually, we've all got used to biodiversity net gain over the last year or two, and you could say that fits quite well with this, but actually BNG isn't explicitly referred to, so it might well be that BNG sits outside environmental outcome reports too. We've got indicators there that sit underneath, and again, interesting as to how exactly one would go about demonstrating that we're complying with those. I think biodiversity is probably a relatively simple environmental discipline to give an example for. I'm going to be really interested to see when we sort of start getting into cultural heritage or landscape, and some of the sort of softer, less quantified disciplines about how actually you can go and demonstrate that we're supporting those outcomes. I and colleagues have also been looking through the consultation, looking through the Levelling Up and Regeneration Bill about, well, what if a project doesn't support the delivery of an outcome? I think we're fairly used to developing projects that generate traffic and therefore increase emissions. So what actually if we're not providing a positive change in relation to air quality? It's not set out whether or not it's in the planning, gets considered in the planning balance or other things, we don't yet know. There's still going to be the requirement, obviously, to comply with policies in the development plan within the MPPF. And it's going to be really interesting to see how some of the professional institutes respond to this. Within IEMA, we're looking at how our guidance can be suitable for EIA and EOR. The previous slides showed that we've got landscape and seascape rather than landscape and visual. So will the Landscape Institute be looking at the guidelines for landscape and visual impact assessment, will visual considerations fall away or become less important? I think there's sort of lots of those sort of details that need to be worked through. The government's really clear about what it wants an environmental outcome report to be, and the slide summarises that for you, so I won't read it out. But the intention is that the EOR is a short, high-level summary. It's intended to be really accessible. I think really it's about providing the public and the lay element of decision makers with the information that they need, rather than EIA, which is trying to provide information for the public and for technical consultees. I guess at WSP we're really supportive of this. We've recently completed sort of really highly slimmed down ES for the Camborne to Cambridge transport corridor improvements, and through that we've been focusing on what the public wants to see and providing information at the level that they need, and then we've appended the details that the consultee needs. So it's an approach that we're already adopting, and we think is really good. There is a but, and I think the but for our industry is that there's no suggestion within the consultation of a change to the technical reports, the technical information that we need to be providing for consultees and demonstrating compliance with policy. So while at the moment EIA can try and provide for the public and provide for technical consultees, here we could have essentially an additional layer of assessment. So rather than having one noise chapter within the environmental statement, we could have a noise chapter in the environmental outcome report for the public, and then we could have a standalone noise report that provides the environmental health officer with what they need. So it might well be that there's some streamlining, but there might also be a bit of a duplication and an increased burden to address that. And the courts have been pretty resistant over the last few years to take on challenges about the quality of the information provided in environmental statements. Is that going to hold, or will there be some initial challenge about what goes into an environmental outcome report or not? I think a lot might depend about what the guidance says. A couple of things that are changing or given a bit of increased importance that's probably worth talking about. There's some quotes on the screen there that are lifted from the consultation around alternatives. And essentially the government's looking for an increased focus on alternatives, and particularly an increased focus on the audit trail. So realistically, I think many of our sort of documentation alternatives in environmental statement is retrospective. Here, actually, the suggestion is that they want developers to provide a summary record of their decision making on alternatives. I think we're going to need to be live to that through the design process, rather than just picking up on it at the end, as we might often do. EIA doesn't currently require the consideration of alternatives. It requires the reasonable alternatives that have been considered to be documented. As you can see, the suggestion here is that realistic alternatives should be considered. What realistic is going to need to be defined, but we may well therefore need to do more on alternatives. There's also a link between alternatives and mitigation, and it's worth just sort of touching on mitigation and monitoring. So the government is proposing to establish the mitigation hierarchy of avoidance, mitigation, compensation in legislation, and that's going to be the first time that's going to be done. And then they're looking to EORs to then report on how that mitigation hierarchy has been applied. They've included the potential for adaptive mitigation, and this is sort of quite exciting, probably something we're more used to in the field of transport assessment, but actually defining an outcome that we want to achieve, identifying the mitigation that we think is going to be needed to get us there, but then suggesting that that mitigation can be adapted if actually monitoring is identifying that it's either too much or too little, and that's probably a new risk for us, in that actually if we've defined that we're going to deliver an outcome and then we're identifying that actually we're not, there is the potential for enforcement action to secure the outcome that's been identified. Now, I think in the context of infrastructure projects, many of which might have an environmental permit that sits alongside, that makes a lot of sense and it's quite a lot easier. In the context of residential projects, where there could be a different promoter to a house builder, to then plots being passed on, individual houses being purchased, plus the question of causality, I think that's going to be really interesting, and a potential challenge, a potential area of risk that we're going to need to be mindful of. Outside of this sector, we do lots of work for national highways, and even they admit that through their post-opening evaluation reports that they often aren't able to meet what they achieve through their monitoring targets. So the potential for enforcement is one that I think we're all going to need to consider. Something that's really positive, the government's really supportive and asking for more in relation to the better use of data. Having more open, accessible data that can be used, considering how data can be used for the long term, how it can be used through plan making, projects, through monitoring, and also then how data from one plan, one project can then be used to provide an evidence base that might well help to streamline future assessment work. All really good stuff. There is a but again here. This slide is blank because there's no how in the consultation about how this is to be achieved, and I think it raises lots of questions if we've got centralized data around quality assurance, validity management, costs, etc. So I think there's quite a lot to be worked through, but the links to digital is really positive. Again, it's something we're really excited about. This is our sort of 10 steps to digital EIA, and looking at how data and digital practice can be used right through the assessment process. It's happening now, and there's lots more potential to deliver the benefits from it. And it's good that the government's open to it. We're going to need to be working with them about how it works and what it means in practice. So just on these issues then, so has the government achieved what they wanted to? So this does look efficient, having the same process for plans and projects, really positive. Duplication, probably a bit more of a question mark between the requirements of the technical reports not changing, the fact that habitats regulation assessment, other biodiversity net gain, climate could sit outside. That seems like a missed opportunity, and probably one that we want to be going back to the government on to see whether or not they can streamline a bit more. Risk aversion, the criteria that they're proposing, it looks really positive that they are thinking about how they can help to take out some of the delays to development. Focus, interesting, to get rid of scoping and to just try and be proportionate. It may well work. Data, as I've just said, really positive ambition. Lots on the how to be worked through. My take, because this comes in, it's going to change my job a lot, and I'm really positive around the ambition and the basic principle around the cascading of national objectives down to that local level. It's actually, step back from it, it's really logical. Perhaps it's something we should have been thinking about before, so it's something to get behind. It's really good, that the government's thinking about how we can better inform decision makers and engage with communities and be accessible, be proportionate, really positive. It's really good to see how they're considering, how some of the risks can be taken out of the system. But we probably need to be feeding back through the consultation responses about how actually we can try and make sure they're not introducing new ones. And the opportunities around data, digital, it's really exciting. So that's really all I wanted to say. So what comes next? Consultation closes on the 9th of June, and lots of us will be responding. There is then going to be further consultation on the environmental outcomes and the indicators themselves. This isn't set out in the consultation, but we understand the ambition is that these changes will come into force in 2025. And I suppose actually that does have a question mark associated with it, given that this is going to need both primary and then secondary legislation, and we've got an election that has to come next year. So there is therefore a question mark about whether or not these come in the way that the government is currently envisaging. And then to say that the government has included a question around the length of the transitional provisions from 6 months to 12 years. So 6 months to 2 years rather than 12 years. So there may well be a bit of a lag too. I see we've got a couple of questions that have already come in. Please do put them on the Q&A. We're actually both us and the Federation are actually really interested to hear views as well as questions, so put them in. My contact details are there if anyone has questions that come to them afterwards. And actually, if this has stimulated discussion and you've got colleagues who would like to know more, then get in touch. We're happy to try and help. That was it. I will pass back to Phil. I will stop sharing and we can have a look at some of these questions. Thank you.
Brilliant. Thank you very much for that, Stefan. A really useful canter through the consultation document. I've got a couple of questions of my own to start with before we look at the question and answers. The first one is around what types of outcomes you think the government will be including within their consultation through the secondary legislation consultation, which presumably will take place, later this year, early next year.
I think it'll be about the improvements that they've set out in the improvement plan. It's interesting, I would say, that the ecology example that they've given is so vague, because it just refers to improvement. It doesn't really define that more closely, and it, as I said, it hasn't gone to the level of linking it to BNG and then quantifying it. So for some of the others, we still have air quality issues, and the government's air quality plans are still quite weak. So I think the others will probably about those sort of loose improvements. I wouldn't expect them to be defining figures in the same way as not putting residents at exposure to, say, NO2 levels above 40 micrograms. I can't imagine them doing that. I think it's going to stay loose. Okay. But I'm interested. I don't know.
Yeah, absolutely. No, thank you. And another one, another question relates to, and I think it was something that was brought up at the number 5 Chambers annual policy conference. A question around whether this is a move towards a more kind of numerical analysis of environmental impact, rather than a qualitative assessment of the impacts.
I think the push on data suggests that it could well be, and I think that's a good opportunity for us. I think if we rewind a couple of years to the planning for the future white paper, and there was suggestions in there that they wanted some of these sort of assessment processes to be much more mechanized, for want of a better term. Plug some data in and a computer's going to tell you the answer out at the end of it. So I'm sure there is still that some of that ambition within DLUC. Obviously it hasn't made it onto the page of the consultation quite as clearly as it was in that white paper, but it is something that we should be excited about. The data does allow us to do things better, and then quite how you deal with that for some of the softer skills, softer disciplines, then good luck.
No, fair enough. My third question actually relates to one of the questions that's been asked in the Q&A section. I think it's something that is going to exercise our particular sector probably the most of all the issues within the consultation, and that's the issue of enforcement and the potential, which that is actually included within the consultation at para 8.9 for bonds, the requirement for bonds for not actually achieving environmental outcomes. So I think it's Richard Kelly who's asked, is there clarity on how the government expects to transfer liability? Does it pass with the land? Does it pass to the new owners? And then that whole issue of bonds and how long they may have to stay in place for, etc., and how on earth do local authorities enforce those kinds of issues?
Well, I'm just glad that Richard has asked a closed question as his first question, because I can say no to that first question, that there isn't the clarity. And the consultation makes clear that they recognise that there's various different regimes, from Planning Act to forestry to marine, that gets covered by the switch to EORs. And I think this is a much bigger challenge for our industry than it is for many of those. And I think it's really important in our consultation responses that we're making the challenge clear on that. I'm not a transport planner, so some of the the issues around commuted sums for transport, mitigation, etc. I'm no expert on, but it might well be that there are lessons that could be learned from that system that we might want to apply and suggest the government apply. But I don't know, and I really struggle to see exactly how it will work at the moment.
I think the biggest concern that I have is just how long those improvements might need to be monitored over. Yeah. BNG is 30 years, which is obviously a considerable length of time. I'm not quite sure how local authorities are going to achieve that for BNG, let alone for the outcomes that come from EOR reports. I think that's a real concern from our industry. Another question is there any suggestion that screening directions or an equivalent process will be retained?
There's no reference to it at all. I think the government is hoping that the criteria-based approach will make this a lot clearer, such that the requirement to go to the Secretary of State would be less. There is, so for some of this is really quite easy and straightforward. Size of site, extent of development, etc., proximity to sites at different levels of designation. The reference to the source pathway receptor model is a little bit less clear in terms of actually how that would then be applied. Again, I think that I've got to say the screening direction point isn't something I thought about, and there's no reference to it. And again, I think that's something that we want to be going back to the government on and saying that is perhaps a time-consuming, but still a successful process for when an authority has not made a reasonable decision.
Wonderful. Question in from Ellie Williams. What will it mean for amending legacy applications accompanied by an EIA?
Again, these answers are rubbish. I appreciate that. The consultation again doesn't make that clear. So when the government introduced the 2017 EIA regulations, the transitional provisions were pretty clear about legacy applications, and they're going to need to have something again, but they've not made it clear. And actually, the flip side of that is so that's the sort of about the legacy stuff. But I'm also interested in, this is very much meant to be a sort of a filtered down approach of plans into projects. Well, actually, so what if we've not got an EOR for a plan because we've got a plan that doesn't have an EOR? So there's quite a few legacy type issues that really needs thinking through, and I suppose that is the challenge of a completely new regime, is that there's an awful lot of these changes, and they just haven't got into that level of
Okay, I don't think it's your questions that are rubbish. Certainly not. I think it's more that detail is just simply not there at the minute within the consultation document. Final question: do you know what the transitionary arrangements will be for this new process? Will it bite of a date, and then will it be applied to EIA applications currently in the system?
So all I could really say on that is that I think it's the final question in the consultation asks for advice as to how long the transitional provisions should be, but they don't cover that, what would happen in that period, or the legacy plans or projects at all, I'm afraid.
Okay, fair enough. I mean, I know there is, as I say, a lot of detail to come on this. I think local authorities will probably be concerned about the resource ask, particularly learning not just this new system, but also all of the other changes that the government are thinking about bringing in to the planning process. Obviously, we've got several consultation documents out at the moment. There's a whole host waiting in the wings that DLUC are talking about consulting over the next 12 months or so. So there is a big ask on pretty tight local authority resources to learn all of these new processes, to understand them, to apply them properly and consistently. And I'm not quite sure whether they are geared up for doing that.
But I think that's something that we as an industry should be going back on, both that burden for authorities and the potential for that introducing delay, but also the fact that, I didn't say it in the presentation, but this is the government changing some EU-derived legislation, but they've really not done that root and branch review. This is essentially a playing at the edges. We're still going to have that same suite of technical information to make sure that all of the consultees don't object, and then we're going to have EOR sitting on the top. So in some senses, the proportionality, it is beneficial. I can see how there will be some streamlining of benefits of that. But I also think there is duplication, that from an authority, they're going to have two things to wade through rather than one. And that's a cost to them, it's a cost to us.
Absolutely.
If we can if it's something that many of us are saying in the response, then hopefully something that can be taken on board.
Perfect. Well, I think we've got to the end of the questions and answers. If there's any more, I'll just give a couple of seconds for people to type any more in that they've got. For me, it's just final thing to say is a thank you to Stefan for taking his time to take us through that today. I think it's been really useful, certainly helped me in kind of shaping my ideas for responding to this particular consultation. We will be circulating the slides at the end of this presentation, so people have got those, and obviously we've recorded it and it will be placed on our website. So if there's no further questions, thank you very much for attending today. Thank you again to Stefan, and I hope you have a good rest of your day. Take care.
Thank you all. Bye-bye.
Thank you.